Senate has really busted our guts to consult our members over the last 3 days, bearing in mind your appeals to us on Monday.
Yeah.
And we've had responses from 70 members of Senate, right, which is almost as many responses in 3 days as the Commission got in a year. And our members really have made a huge effort to engage with the report. And it is disappointing that obviously that so many constituencies are not represented here today.
Okay. So are you happy now that you're not the only one?
How do you feel about proceeding current?
I don't know. Do we meet Quran? That's the question.
Thank you. We have well, first of all, I would like to thank everyone for taking the time to consider the report in a very short space of time. And having gone through it, I think the issues are familiar to most of us. And I'm not going to comment on the quality of the report and its recommendation. I'd like to hear what you think. So, but the most important thing for me is I'll take the first round, which will be a comment generally on the report. But the most critical part for me would be our attitude to the recommendations that are being made and what we want to do with those recommendations, whether we think we should proceed with them or some of them, or how we should handle them. Okay, so let's start with the first aspect, which is a commentary on the report. Remembering that it is a final report, but your comments might just color what our view and attitudes are with regard to the recommendations. Who's going to take the first step? So we're all happy with the report. Jeremy.
I'm slightly hesitant about taking the first step. If Nikki sends her apologies, I'm sure she would be much more diplomatic about this than I'm going to be. So let me report on what we've done. We set up a Vula poll through the Vula site, asking for members of Senate to send us comments. We didn't ask for a simple poll on do you vote for or against. We asked whether members of Senate would identify things they liked about the report and things that they disliked about the report. So open-ended questions. And we got 50 responses to that by this morning. Nikki and I got another 20-odd responses by personal emails to us. We also, late yesterday, sent out a 4- or 5-page commentary on the report, which tried to summarize the report as we saw it, or as I saw it, with Nikki's advice, and to draw attention to some of the issues that it raised. And many of the responses we got this morning were responses to that commentary. And we're very happy to circulate that commentary to anyone else who would like to see it if they haven't seen it already. And the general response from members of Senate was quite clear. I should say that it's possible, of course, that 70 responses from Senate is not representative of the full breadth of opinion in the Senate. And my suspicion is that the critics of this report are overrepresented amongst the people who responded. That said, if we collate the comments we got on the good things about the report, it's 1.5 pages long. And if we look at the collation of the negative reports, the criticisms of the report, it's 11 pages long. So we have 1 and a bit pages of praise and 10 or 11 pages of criticism, which is, I think, broadly the response from Senate. The responses from Senate members I describe them as a tsunami of criticism of this report. And I think, I talk in detail, I don't want to take up much time, we can come back to this. But I think that just a few points stand out. And the first is, members of Senate are very clear that they had high hopes of this, right? That there was an expectation that, notwithstanding a process that led to the appointment of the Commission, that the Commission would be able to help us in reflecting critically about our own strengths and weaknesses as an institution and to learn from that. But the members of Senate almost unanimously in their submissions have voiced disappointment with the report, deep disappointment with the report. As a number of people said, this is an opportunity missed in a number of respects. They point to factual errors, they point to some quite absurd points, such as one of the submissions which is quoted is from apparently a pseudonymous member of the public who opines about all sorts of things in Cape Town. That there's apparently no fact-checking, that the Commission appears to have no understanding of the complexities of many of the issues involved, that on many of these issues the University has taken grave, serious steps to improve the situation long before the report was completed, and crucially I suppose that the report reflects a fundamental set of biases and assumptions about the issue, that essentially it exonerates the students completely, the student protesters, and castigates with very little evidence the management, university and academics. We have 11 pages of criticism of that. I'm very happy to go into detail, but I think I should probably pass on now.
Thank you very much.
Can I also add one thing? You did ask us about the recommendations.
I'll come back to the recommendations.
Well, the members of the Senate were very clear that actually the recommendations, as set out at the end, are not contentious. The recommendations are very sensible, which I should have made that clear at the beginning, I'm afraid. The recommendations in the recommendation section are for the most part not contentious, and we don't think they're controversial. And I don't think that any of the submissions, I stand corrected, I don't think any of the 70-odd submissions we've had have taken a significant issue with a single one of the recommendations in the recommendation section. It's the body of the report which members of the Senate have raised so many criticisms of, not the recommendations.
Okay, interesting. Yes, sir.
Chair, I would like to, by way of emphasis, report, at least from the Faculty of Law, what has already been said, that there appears to be a general consensus that the recommendations are fine, but the substance of the report is problematic, especially because of the methodology that the submissions were based mostly on untested facts. And the report itself says that none of the submissions and allegations were tested. And in some cases, there was evidence available within the university which should have been used, but was not. And then, nevertheless, the report makes factual findings, which is quite questionable. So at that level, that there is an attempt in the report to make factual findings from untested submissions and allegations, that it is frankly very flawed. But generally, the recommendations are not being objected to.
Yes, sir.
Yes, Chair. Now, due to time, I mean, we are dealing with a constituency which is mostly made up of students. Generally, there was a feeling that more could have been done on the report, but given the time in which it was given to commence and the issues that it was dealing with, we sort of understood that it's so far-fetched to expect concrete empirical evidence on some of the bigger structural issues that we're dealing with in the university. And I think also the question of empiricism evidence is also a contested terrain when it comes to
again, imperialism or
not empiricism, evidence. You know, it's also a contested terrain when we are dealing with issues of racism and particularly institutional racism. So I thought, you know, perhaps that is important to make. But secondly, there was an an agreement, an overwhelming agreement conceptually in how the report dealt with racism. But we sort of seen a possible conflict on how the conceptual understanding of racism differs from the general understanding how racism is understood in South Africa. And perhaps this is a conversation that the university must push harder on, that there needs to be an emphasis on whether could we run away from the fact that racism is not just an act of prejudices, but is an act of power, which comes out strongly in the report in terms of how racism is defined. And I think in that line, I mean, generally our people were a bit sort of happy about the fact that there is a claim that in the university, in terms of how it's designed, there is a deliberate exclusion of black people without taking away the many efforts that the university has done or continues to do. But those efforts are very slow in dealing with the structural problems that we are facing. And we have felt that maybe the commissioner could have gave us, even if it doesn't have practical ways of how, as a university, we can deal with the long-lasting tradition of structural problems, which, in essence, whether it didn't need fact findings from people to submit in the university to testify that the university is racist. The body of the setup of the university is quite clear, even the blind can see. So that's, in fact, our feeling that perhaps the commissioner, if it had more time and more resources, we could have dealt with substantively how we could deal with the structural problems. But the findings to us are not really generally a problem.
Yeah, I actually think this discussion is very interesting because the chapter on racism is the longest chapter. I think that in itself is evidence of the fact that of the institution's racism, the fact that they have to go to such great pain, to great lengths, to try to expose a kind of alleged racism and the practice of racism within ECT. So I think, the fact that it's like the longest portion of the report kind of preempts some of these comments about fact-checking and the fact that there's no evidence and so forth. So I think on that particular aspect, I think the report, that is welcomed in general. I think there are more contentious issues in the report, which I think some of us are also disappointed with, or we felt that the recommendations weren't very strong. These are issues around private security, these are issues around the recommendations made with respect to outstanding cases, specifically for the charges that haven't been levied against students yet. Students being told that they have to go to UCT's internal disciplinary kangaroo court again, whilst the IRTC was meant to be the vehicle which was supposed to serve as a means. I think that there's a contradiction there that appears, because if you consider that there's racism on the one hand, structurally, and then also send back students to go to the same process, we think that that lack of consistency is something that you flag. I think that the third important thing would be around accountability of the executive. Again, it's one of those contradictions of the report. Is very clear in saying how management was inadequate or inappropriate in responding to such issues, but at the same time, again, not having any concrete recommendations of how that should happen. But at the same time, not having any problem with telling students that they need to go through this process or like submit unnecessary documents and so forth to the university, right? So I think insofar as reconciliation is kind of like premised on like truth and so forth, we don't think that that account was truthful. And I think that has kind of limited prospects for the kind of reconciliation that people want to see. But yeah, beyond that, I think the recommendations are also in some parts like very dry. But again, it's nothing like I have a problem with. It's just like different expectations are supposed given students and other people, I guess.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so we read the report and deliberated on it, and the first thing we looked at was the terms of reference of the Commission. And we feel that the Commission acted within those terms of reference set for it. So in that we believe that the report is consistent with the terms of reference set. In regards to the content of the report, we generally agree with it. There are some things that we have seen that dealt with in more detail. For example, sexual harassment, sexual violence. But for now, we're going to only deal with one of the recommendations that we have in that regards, student cases. But we're hoping that we'll be able to have subsequent meetings where we can actually look at the recommendations in more detail, make a better representation to council on what we should do. Now, next thing, Chair, I would like to build up on something that you said on Monday. You said, to paraphrase, when others hold up the mirror to you, you have to take it. And I think that was an important statement to make, because I think this is what this report actually is. It doesn't mean that we'll all agree with it, but it should be a point of departure or consideration about where this university is at this moment. Now, I don't think we should treat the content of this report as being exceptional to UCD, because other universities are also grappling with this problem. Where I think we're exceptional is that we embarked on this IRTC process, and we're learning things, and what we're learning should compel us to act further. So, yes, I think we should be open to actually looking at the content of the report, and if we don't agree with it, we actually should be able to listen to what other perspectives are on the content, rather than dismiss it out of that. I'll leave it for there.
Thank you, Chair. So maybe taking as my starting point the idea of a mirror that's being held up. I think for us as an executive, this is a very important mirror that we have to look at. And the point is, of course, whether there may be aspects that can or may be challenged from a factual point of view. These are perceptions that certainly, it's either facts or it's perceptions that people have about their experience at the university. And from that point of view, we have to take it serious. And of course, we as a university executive have not waited for the outcome of this report to begin to address the concerns that we know that is out there. And so we have been working on, in fact, all of these areas that is outlined by the Commission. And we have, for example, a transformation implementation framework that is that's plotting the implementation of transformation against the strategic plan, and it speaks to 6 areas that all addresses ultimately institutional culture change, which is really what we're trying to get at, and that is highlighted in the report as well. And so we in fact, I would surmise to say that we probably look at some of these issues in a little bit more detail or from a much more nuanced point of view. So that, for example, the experience is racism, a lens at racism which looks beyond the interactions between people, but also takes into place what does the university look like as a physical space, for example. So dealing with issues such as renaming, such as artworks, but also language, taking into account the kind of language that we use. It takes into account identity, it takes into account religious, and to what extent we are an inclusive space. So these recommendations are certainly welcome in that it compels us to look at whether what we are doing is sufficient, whether we should be doing more. And so we've discussed this as an executive on Tuesday. And the recommendations, I think similar to Senate per se, is definitely not problematic. But we do need to engage with the report, because what sits behind the report may require somewhat more interrogation. So, for example, when the report makes the comment about the fact that UCT has a historical system of preference where students whose parents have lived in the residence receive first preference for accommodation in the same residence, that is not factually correct. But what we do need to look at is whether our data on implementation may still reflect that kind of policy. And so that's the kind of interrogation that we would like to do, where there are certain facts. We would like to test it against our real-time data and see whether there is a problem that exists. I have to also, on the issue of racism, which is a very long chapter, also express the disappointment around actually having practical and concrete ways of addressing racism that goes beyond research. We want to be able to see the shift, and we want to be able to measure the shift from an institutional culture and from institutional racism point of view. And what are the practical ways of doing that and having that? Of course, we've started to work on it as well, and it would have been useful to kind of see an outside lens on that perspective. So, and then similarly, Chair, on the issue of the cases, we worked on the outstanding cases as an executive. We actually gave a recommendation to the IRTC on which cases we felt could go forward to the IRTC to be dealt with, and which cases perhaps not, or in fact there was one case not. And so we were hoping for the IRTC to deal with those. But we also we do have a recommendation.
We'll deal with the recommendations later.
Yeah, but we do have a view on the cases. But that's the general view. I don't know if my colleague wants to add.
Thank you, Chair. So I just want to echo what my colleague here said, that you see, as a BAC, we were less interested in the semantics around the content in the report, but more around the issues that were flagged. Because remember, these are issues that we have identified as a university community, issues around racism, sexism, sexual violence, mental health, equity, and so forth. So, to the extent that the commissioners also agreed with the experiences that have been reflected in the university community, that those are issues to deal with. That was our interest as the BAC, that you see, we have these issues that we as the university community has identified as problems. External independent parties have also come and agreed that these are indeed problematic. So we would of course have been happy if they had come and told us exactly what to do with regards to each one, but they were not going to be able to do that given the constraints, both in terms of time and resources. So we believe it is now our task as a university community to now try to work from that basis and make recommendations to the University Council to now say that with regards to this particular issue, this is what we would need to be done and so forth. So we are actually happy that the Commission actually worked within these terms of reference. It could have done more if it had been given relevant resources, but we need to be realistic to the fact that they did not have the kind of resources that would have enabled them to actually solve our problems for us. So now that is the task that is left to us to now take forward. So we do accept the report.
Okay, maybe I'll take one or two more, and then so that we can go to recommendations, because we now are just having general conversation on the report.
Thank you. I was rather quite impressed by how the report tried to, as best as possible, establish the cause of fact and the causal sequence from the events of about the events of February 16th, and how they link that to the residences, and also to the chapter on racism, and how they also like view that from the structural view and structural lens. And I felt that the way in which the chapter on structural and student protest was written is that it gave justice to the cause of what was happening on February the 16th. One thing though, which I think the report called, one thing just my take on the report is that they go to great lengths to establish that, you know, in between management and in between forces, there was a particular cause, there was a particular action that was being driven for by the students, and of which there was mismanagement for it. And they go to great lengths to establish their cause. The causality of management's actions towards escalating how the protest has happened, and in ways that could have been prevented. One thing that the report, in my view, failed to do was to, after having established that there was mismanagement about the student protest, and there was, like for instance, even a possible breach of and unlawfulness in terms of how the flag was demolished and so forth, is making recommendations in terms of how to then hold management accountable, because Simon must, sorry, not Simon, the group of Alex Hartz must all have been held accountable for the actions that they've had towards February the 16th. But management actions, insofar as they contributed towards the events of that day, they've never been held accountable. Up until this day, February the 16th is viewed as a one-sided event whereby it was one force exerting force on another, and whereby the one is held to be legitimate, and they were only trying to quell a student protest which was violent. But it's only now in this report that actually students are vindicated. They're vindicated in terms of what they're protesting for, that it was just. They vindicated that in terms of how the protest was managed was harsh, and to critically management had breached the duty of care. They also vindicated in terms of they established that they're not the only ones that were in the wrong, but that these are two forces that acted equally wrong or against each other. So the report, but on the one side, in other chapters about the November 16th cases, the report establishes that UCT should decide whether the charge of the students or not. But on the other end, about management's actions in the so far as they dealt with events of February the 16th, it doesn't say this is how they ought to be held accountable. And for me, I feel like this is the way, something whereby the report lacked, is that we needed, I guess it would have been symbolic for students to see that not only are they being held accountable, but the other parties also being brought to the table. And this is where reconciliation starts, where both parties are viewed and that they acknowledge the harm they've contributed or caused towards each other. Those are my tentative views about the report.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry I was late. Yeah, it was a bit of a challenge for consultations to take place. So I had some limited conversations, I can call it, because also the time was very short for us. So straight off the bat, I'll say that I think today we can have a general comment, but we really need time for real engagement, and there has been some communications already about trying to find a date when we can also have a bigger alumni association meeting, so that we can have engagement with a broad gathering of alumni. I think what I have to say is very similar to what Dr. Chinyoka just said, which is it's really encouraging to see that the issues are there. It's important that, we don't solve any problem if we can't have the courage and the honesty to name what the problems are. So that is very important and appreciated. Also, there's a general sense that yes, the IRTC, the commissioners, have honoured their contract in terms of what the TRs were. A question, and I think this is one of the things that we that needs more discussion is related to the very broad recommendations. So they don't provide sufficient direction, and in some cases one is asking, what do they really mean? You know, what is the actual implication of this? So that also in terms of what we recommend to council, we are in tune with what their intention is. Just, I think, two more points to make. There is a definite concern, Chair, around the student situation. I'm happy to hear that Professor Fettis is saying there is a proposal from the executive. But it is worrying that one of the big problems is the students. We had to call a pause so that students were not going to be victimized by the institution. And for it to come back, it's just worrying for me that I actually don't know how to understand that, and it's something that maybe one just needs more time to process. Why? And I do understand in terms of the commissioners. I mean, they spoke to this the other day and said they had limited capacity, but it is. I would like to see UCT flourishing, not because of the university, but because of the city that I have been born in and live in. And it really worries me that if we don't reach a place where people feel that there's justice, that we're not going to have that. And so that, I think, I'm concerned is going to be a bigger sticking point than we might be realize. But let me leave that there. And then just one kind of technical thing. On page 8, it reads, while we agree with this proposition of the alumni as supported by other submissions, we do not accept the next proposition which is made, that physical violence is always justified by the non-physical violence that preceded it. So nowhere does the alumni submission actually say that. So I think that is the author's interpretation, which I would say is not an accurate reflection of what's in the submission. And so I don't know how we address that, but just to point that out. Thank you.
I think let's go to recommendations, because as I said earlier on, we are beyond. The report is what it is. It's their report. They have recorded what they had in the way that they have. So we want to be able to change that. I guess in the course of the discussions, we are at liberty to point out the shortcomings of the report.
There is, Edwina wrote in and asked that we noted this meeting that there are at least 2 people who felt that they've been promised confidentiality, and in the report they're named, and they're now sitting in a situation where they feel they can be victimized. And she asked that just be noted at this meeting. I don't know whether those are the only 2, but it was a big issue.
Do you want to comment on this one?
Yeah, Chair, the complaint has also come to my attention, and I have to say we probably will need more information about it. It is not quite clear whether the member of staff specifically requested confidentiality, or the 2 members of staff. I looked at how written submissions was solicited by the IRTC, and just looking at the last communication, speaking to confidentiality, it says it is important to note that all evidence of information provided by any person to the IRTC in the course of its work will be confidential if so requested. And so we're still trying to ascertain whether confidentiality was in fact requested. I also spoke to one of the staff members, and that staff member wasn't able to clarify that, and will actually also go back to the submission.
I think this is a very serious point. And I think that the Commission showed a very serious error of judgment in the way in which they reported the allegations made by these two past staff members, and they identified the department, and effectively the head of the department, about which these allegations are being made. This is a public document where, where now we have a situation where in a department at its university, people are looking at each other, thinking, you stabbed me in the back, you told lies about me, you made things up, you did this, now this was supposed to be confidential, I know about it. This is a Commission for Institutional Reconciliation and Transformation. And the Commission for Institutional Reconciliation and Transformation has just created a huge problem in the department by naming the individuals and naming the department. This is a really appalling error of judgment. I mean, I know that my understanding is, and maybe elaborate, my understanding is that the members of the department have said, this is a complete misrepresentation of the facts in the department, it's a misunderstanding of the appointment processes and so on, but this is now in the public domain, and Iqbal Survey is probably going to run with it for his own purposes. It's going to be splashed all over the Cape Times repeatedly, right? And these are just completely untested allegations, and if we think of them as whistleblowers, if their whistleblowers have been named, this is appalling. This is a complete violation of the procedures we have at the university for, if you like, whistleblowing and dealing with allegations of this sort. I mean, if we could pull in a document, and actually take out these allegations, it would be great, but unfortunately it's in the public domain already.
I don't want us to spend too much time on this, because Loretta's point is clear that the procedures are spelled out. So if you are wishing to make an oral submission, there are procedures that are stipulated there. If you're making a written submission and you wish that that submission be confidential, you request accordingly. And that's the point about establishing whether, in fact, the people who made the submission indicated that this is a confidential submission. Because it is so that some people may have no problem in making a written submission and want it attributed to them. So we have to establish the facts of the matter first before we pronounce on this. And I fear that if we continue with this discussion, we're going to rush into conclusions without a firm foundation. So I think we should note it and allow Loretta to continue with work that she's doing to establish what the true facts of the situation are.
I think that kind of two comments I want to make. So even though there was a proviso that information will be confidential if you requested it to do so, I think in that kind of broad spirit of the request for submissions, I think that's kind of like, people perhaps tend to not notice those kind of small details. So I think in that spirit, maybe that perception is kind of warranted, right? In the sense that the Commission, or if the perception that the Commission created this sense that they're like this safe space where you can come and tell the truth about racism and GPT and so forth, I think then on some sense there's kind of like, on some level, an obligation to try to protect people from that backlash. And the second point then would be to say that we should at least take a position to say that those particular staff members aren't going to be victimized, aren't going to, that this commission and the university staff is going to try to make sure that those people who've made submissions and who've now have come to be in the public kind of spotlight and so forth, are going to be protected from the kind of people who have power to victimize them. I think that should be the position.
I think that point is correct. So. But I do want us to entertain the idea that I do make allegations against people in public, and I like owning up to those allegations. So when I make them openly and publicly. Some people prefer to make them anonymously. And the purpose of doing it in public is to pursue a debate, because there will be a response and you sustain the response. It's a way of engaging openly and owning up to the point. So all I'm saying is that you must entertain the idea that the structure and the procedures of this allowed for people who wanted to make submissions openly are allowed to, and want to make submissions confidentially are allowed to. So we can't take a view on this now until we've actually established the facts of this situation. All I'm saying is that let's not take conclusive views. Let's go into it. The people who submitted have complained. We have not had the occasion to speak to the commissioners to find out what actually happened. And to be fair, we have to get their side of the story too. So I fear that we're going to take positions here which are actually not going to be helpful for dealing with this matter. Okay, last two. Jeremy.
I think there's a broader point here, though, which is, I mean, it's about the way in which the Commission has assembled and presented evidence. This comes across as being a very shoddy and rushed exercise.
Objection.
There's
no evidence for what he's saying right now.
Yeah. Yes, I think it's unhelpful, Jeremy, because
let me give some evidence.
This is quite presumptuous. We have a complaint. We've asked the people who submitted the complaint to tell us what the basis of the complaint is. We've not heard the Commissioner's side of the story. Until we get that, and this is recorded, until we get to that, we are making conclusive positions which may very well be unfounded. So let's not be hot under the collar on this until we get to the bottom of the facts of the matter.
May I finish, Mr. Chair?
Please go ahead.
Thank you. I think we should be quite hot under the collar over this, because actually because individuals might suffer harm, either because they are victimised, because they are, let's call it whistleblowers, or because they're in the department concerned, which has had untested allegations against it. Now, I think with hindsight, surely we can agree that it would have been much more appropriate if the commissioners had gone back to the staff who made the submission and asked them, do you mind if we name you? Now, you're quite right to say that maybe the commissioners did do that, and we should ascertain that before we come to any... With
due respect, you really are taking our time.
Yes.
Yeah.
I agree.
We don't know if the commissioners asked that.
But we do know with respect to...
All we know is that there is a complaint. Until we get the commissioner's side of the story, we're not able to discuss this matter. And you insist on making a conclusive point without... You're actually accusing the commissioners of conducting themselves in exactly the way that you're conducting yourself. You can't take a conclusive view until you've had the full facts of the matter.
That's all I'm saying, Chair, is
that
they did not take the full facts.
I don't know that. I do not know that. I'm glad that you do. Because until we get their side of the story, I'm not able, and I don't think any of us should presume that they are in a position to take a view on this matter. So you have no basis to be hot under the collar until you get the full story. That's all I'm saying to you. Because it's not unusual for anybody to want to make a submission in these processes on an open basis. It's not unusual. It's not unusual for a commission to actually provide procedures that enable that to happen. Because after all, this is going to be an ongoing discourse and discussion about these issues. So these colleagues are saying that they didn't want this to happen. Our responsibility as an institution is to ensure that now that it is out there, we protect each other as much as possible and allow a conversation around the underlying issues to be dealt with, and not obviously they fear that they may be victimized as a result. And that's one of the things that this report highlights, that there is a culture of fear in the institution. It's highlighted by their complaints. So it actually says to us, we must find a way of dealing with that. But I think we run the danger here on record of impugning particular conduct to commissioners without giving them a fair opportunity to respond. Let's get to the bottom of the issues first.
I'm not going to engage, respond. I just want to make a different point. Can I make a different point?
No.
Yeah, Chair, I wanted to just give weight to what you are saying so I don't waste time. And I'm in full support that there's no way which you can come to a conclusion without following due process. First, to establish whether they did mention that their names not to be named on the report. Also, secondly, to request from the commissioners who have participated whether such information or did they follow up on such allegations. But I think for now, I would like to plead with the members of the House that we need to deal with other issues rather than start with this issue.
But can I say that, so you follow the process, but we do have to give regard to the fact that there is a difficult situation arising from this disclosure which we have to manage. Okay, shall we talk to the recommendations? I'm going to talk to the recommendations.
One quick footnote, to be very quick.
Now, you may not comment on the issue that we've just closed.
No, it's a related issue.
Now, we're raising a discussion now on recommendations.
So you're not allowing me to speak?
No.
Yes.
Yes, Chair, with regard to recommendations, thank you. So, the BAC met on Wednesday, and so we could make a substantive recommendation on one issue, but the remaining issue we're going to come here for more time because we need more engagement. So the issue we could make a recommendation on was the issue with regards to the outstanding cases for students that are, so all the cases that are outstanding from whether it be scheduled or subsequent protests be withdrawn by council. Because the opportunity was given to the university to submit such cases or the charges to the commissioners. And the fact that it did not happen when it was supposed to happen means now that that ship has sailed. So you have to reopen that process now will be against the spirit of restorative justice. So we recommend that all those charges be withdrawn or dismissed.
Is that support for recommendation 11?
I don't think the commissioners actually want to detail.
So,
addressing yourself to recommendation 11 because recommendation 11 speaks to outstanding cases of cases 16 and 17.
Yeah.
So are you saying that we should accept that recommendation?
The commissioners did not go into detail. They just said they did not have too much to work with because the university had not prepared charges on the students by the time they concluded their work. So we are saying now that ship has sailed for the university to institute those charges. So all those cases should be withdrawn.
Okay. I thought the executive had reflected on this. So let's hear what they have to say.
Yes, Chair. So we, in our deliberations, we distinguish between those cases that are outstanding, in other words, cases where there has not been charges formulated, or where charges were formulated and the cases did not proceed, versus the 3 outstanding cases with respect to clemency. In other words, cases that went through the tribunal process, clemency was granted, but was not heard by the Commission in order to convert that into amnesty. So I want to deal first with that later part. And there the executive felt that, and so the recommendation from the Commission was to reconstitute 3 members of the IRTC to look at those cases. We've taken a slightly different view, and that is to say that we believe that we should forward those 3 cases to council to consider providing amnesty in the same way that it's provided amnesty on the other cases. In other words, not to go via a reconstituted IRTC. Maybe just to clarify what the position was with respect to the outstanding cases. We went through a process where we...
so those cases are 3 individuals.
So that's the 3 clemency cases, Chair. That's our recommendation on that. I now want to speak to the other outstanding cases.
Yeah.
And there I just need to note that what we did before it was referred to the IRTC, we went through all of the cases. we indicated to the IRTC which cases we believe that we would be willing to drop. We then had a list of cases where we asked the IRTC to consider those cases on a restorative justice basis. There was one case, and I don't think I should speak to that case in public, but there was one case where we believed that we wouldn't want to follow that process. In other words, either drop the charges or ask the IRTC to declare it. But that's the work that we did. And in fact, we then went further and we spoke to the complainants in those cases. Myself and some of the other executives met with the various complainants in those cases, and we explained that this was the recommendation that we were going to make to the IRTC. In other words, we tried to close the gap, both on the side of people that complained as well as dealing with the cases itself. So that's the basis on which we referred the cases to the IRTC, and we thought that would help the IRTC to come to a view where it's certainly those cases where we said we are willing to drop the charges. But I think we would like to, in the wake of the fact that the IRTC did not look at it, I think we need to maybe just get a view from the rest of the steering committee, and then we will have to go back and think about what is the best way forward with these cases.
Good.
Can we discuss the first one? That's in respect of the 3 candidates. Is there any objection to the recommendation from the executive to convert those into amnesties?
So I think there were 2 kind of recommendations. The one is that is going to, the 3 cases which already have charges are going to be taken to council, and the other one is to ask for feedback from
I'm
us.
saying that we should deal with that first one first, and take a decision as to whether we're agreed with the recommendation of the executive. Make that recommendation.
If it's good faith, the council is going to respond with which responded to the initial cases of clemency that was taken to them for the other students that have already received clemency. I think that should be favorable on our side.
Yes, we are support that too.
Okay, Chair, I actually support that we actually, as the steering committee, just like we did with the other amnesty cases, that we, as the steering committee, actually recommend to council, so that it doesn't seem as if council has to look at those issues afresh without any recommendation from a substantive committee like the steering committee. So I want us, as the steering committee, to actually say we support that recommendation for amnesties.
Jeremy?
So on a procedural point, when we discussed this before, there was, I thought, a general agreement, including amongst the commissioners. Do you recall that Commissioner Yacoub articulated this, that it was not reasonable for us to be considering our position on an amnesty issue without some detail about what it was that was being amnestied. And Commissioner Yacoub pretty much insisted that some information be circulated about what events were being amnestied. The individuals were not named, but that the general things that were covered were listed. And in fact, that was the procedure that the IRTC then and Council adopted with respect to the first batch of amnesties. And I think it would be appropriate to do the same thing with any further issues of amnesty. I mean, I think from the point of view of Senate, members of the Senate have made it very clear that they would like the outstanding cases to be dealt with, so that there is enormous sympathy on the part of the Senate to dealing with these cases. But I think that we should follow the position adopted by Commissioner Yacoub originally and actually have the same standard that the actions that are being amnestied should be put before us before we're asked to agree to the amnesty.
Chair, I disagree with that point, because when we made those decisions with regards to the previous amnesties, there was an opportunity for the commissioners to deal with those cases. So these 3 cases, there's not going to be any opportunity for the commissioners to deal with So I would not want us now to get hamstrung into those kinds of semantics. I would just want us to accept the position from the executive. The executive are the ones who deal with these cases, so they are coming up with a proposal, and I want us to support that proposal as the steering committee, without having to now act as if we are tribunal here.
Yeah, just to add on Dr. Terry's view, that generally we should not try to create another kangaroo court that seems to replace what is already has happened before. But I do think that whatever mechanisms that council together executive can find a way in which it does not just give people on the blanket scale of amnesty, but also takes into consideration that these processes have long gone, and these are people who didn't apply to those processes. But I think a suggestion must be just tabled to the council without subjecting people to the very same processes, because to prepare for such time, which I don't think at this context we do have the time to elect people to write their written submissions and to have an impartial or some people who are not biased, because people who sit on the council, they have the interest of the university at heart. Just like people who sit on executive, they have the interest of the university at heart. So for such processes that people must make a submission will require an objective outside view, which I think it will take time from what we are trying to do.
Okay.
Chair, maybe just to say, and maybe and this will assist, is that these cases were all cases relating to the same incident. And so the charges would be on page, we see page 19 of the report. We have the charges of the students who already have received amnesty, and I when I look at the list of the outstanding cases, it is very similar charges. So there's nothing different to what has already been granted amnesty on, and that's part of the rationale for wanting to recommend amnesty on very similar charges to council.
I think we might actually all be in more or less agreement. I think that council, we should recommend council gives amnesty, but just as we did when the last one was approved, when the notice goes out, it won't name any names, but it will say student A was charged with X, Y, Z, student B was charged with Y, Z, F, and so on. And so it's really just, if we're saying treat it like the old ones, that's what we did last time. And so it's not about a new tribunal or anything.
Are we happy to proceed on that basis?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's a very good recommendation, because this is an overhang, and we need to move the institution. Now, the second aspect of this, and I think the commissioners are alluding to that in recommendation 12 about disciplinary procedures and fairness and all of this. You're saying that there is no recommendation from you on respect of that.
Chair,
how many students would be affected by it?
I don't have the number right now.
We're outstanding cases.
I can try and look at that, try and find that information whilst we are here, but I do have the list. And like I said, we've previously recommended a very particular view to the IRTC, but we would like to be able to just go through that list again and decide that that's the way that we want to proceed. I think the difficulty for us, Chair, at this point is there are cases that we feel that we made the recommendation that we will withdraw charges, but then there are cases that we ask the IRT to consider. And I think the difficulty for us now is that the IRTC said university must consider it, and of course we have to grapple with what that means, especially in the light of a very strong message that comes think from other stakeholders that doesn't want to see those cases go through a disciplinary process. So I think that's really for us is that group of cases that we asked the IRTC to deal with specifically.
So what I'm hearing is that the executive has done some work and is aligned with regard to in some cases for dropping of charges. We don't know how many, and we don't know how many will be outstanding, and what the basis is for not putting everybody in the same category. So it seems to me that we need to allow that work to be done, and you've made a submission that those should be, all those cases should be dropped. That's your perspective. I suspect that it's a perspective that the students won't agree with. So we need to get to a point where everybody is aligned.
Can I just give numbers, Chair?
Yeah.
So the cases withdrawn came to 12.
Proposed withdrawal, right?
Proposed withdrawal, yeah.
Came to?
12.
Okay.
And then we had 33, so may not be 33 cases, because, but 33 affected students that may be involved in more than one case. And there we referred it to the IRTC. So it's really 33 cases that we will need to find a way forward. And then one case that we felt should not go through, should be either withdrawn or referred to the IRTC.
Thank you, Chair. With regards to recommendation number 12, I would like to understand here, because my interpretation is that this regards any disciplinary process against students, and not just the students charged in this case. And I think that's a very important recommendation there, because I've had, in the last few weeks, actually last year, I've had experiences with the way that the university engages or treats students when cases are brought against them, and I fear it needs improvement, a lot of improvement. There are cases of students who cannot graduate because they're sitting with cases that have been there for 1.5 years, 3 years, and so forth. And I think this really needs to be looked at.
Chair, I'd like to comment on this recommendation 12. I was senior proctor for quite a while before January, and I take the opposite view. I think the recommendation is too specific to legal representation. It could have been more useful if it was restricted to implementing a program of fair disciplinary proceeding. Something like that would be much more, then it could target bigger reforms around the fairness of our proceedings. But as specific as this one is, I cannot see how it is possible to realize this. The university just do not have the resources to do this, partly because in the last 4 years, partly also because of the protests, but also just generally offending, student disciplinary procedures have been extremely overburdened, such that we have accumulated a lot of backlog that we're talking about. We cannot just cope with the number of disciplinary proceedings that are there. The proceedings have become more contested. We have tried to rely on external proctors. The university continues to rely on the faculty of law to provide the proctors, partly because we can't afford this. And so at the student level, the disciplinary proceedings have become more contested and more extended, more acrimonious, extremely expensive for the university. But that's not only there. With regard to academic and past staff as well, there are so many cases, especially now also of sexual harassment, where the university is failing to cope with the caseload at that level as well. And so to have this specific legal provision that we should, in addition to managing this process, which is very expensive, and I don't know how we will resolve it in the next few years, they include this onerous obligation to provide legal representation. It's not saying legal assistance, it's saying legal representation. the university cannot afford it. I don't see how.
Before we go into this recommendation 12, can we wrap up the additional aspect of outstanding cases? So we now have a clear recommendation in respect of the amnesty ones. And the executive is asking to go through those outstanding cases where there have been no disciplinary proceedings. They have 12 that they've identified that possibly cases could be dropped. And then there's 33 outstanding. And until we have a firm recommendation in respect of those, I don't think we have a recommendation to make to council. So are we happy to allow them to conclude work on that and then come back with a recommendation?
I can speak something different, so I don't know the
Okay, thank you. So I think the professor earlier asked what the steering committee thinks should be done with these 33 same cases. I think our position is quite simple. To drop the charges and also commitment to not prosecute people who have been charged or might have been charged of a protest action from 2015 up until the 2 years of protest action basically. And I think this is important, right, because obviously the commissioner to some degree has said, for example, they didn't have the capacity to investigate whether or not these cases, how to do them. But I think in that silence also, because they also make mention of the fact that leaving it to the university to consider whether or not their response was appropriate in light of the motivations and so forth of the students and the context and the reasons that they were protesting, and also in light of the broader principle of restorative justice. I think it's just the most reasonable and sensible thing to do. Given the wide-ranging scope of the indictment that the report makes, the management's failure to appropriately handle and respond to the protest action, I think, so obviously we can't see into the commissioner's mind, but I think there's also a deliberate kind of a test basically to say, we're giving you the test to see how you take up the challenge of moving forward in a spirit of restorative justice. I think to be a blatant failure to just go back and charge those students or to charge any students going forward.
Another way of looking at it though is that if it was as clear cut as all that to take that approach, that's what the commissioner would have recommended. So all the more reason why you want to be quite careful about how you deal with it. And that's what the executive is saying. Afford us time, let's look into this and come back with a recommendation. So I would suggest that we allow the executive to do that and then come back to us and we take a view on that point. Clearly.
Chair, I don't think the executive actually, because what the executive did was to send these 33 odd cases to the commissioners. But in response to this question on Monday, the commissioners say they could not deal with these cases because they did not have charge sheets and all that kind of stuff. So I don't see how reasonable it is for us to, as the steering committee, to now take this matter back to the executive. I think the intention of the executive was for the commissioners to make a recommendation to this committee, that this committee would make a recommendation to council. So I think it is within our brief to just now say, okay, if the commissioners did not deal with these 33 cases, we are recommending, like I said, as BAC, that these charges be dropped.
On what basis?
Because the commissioners in recommendation 11 are saying they should be dealt with as with chapter 2. Right? So in chapter 2, these were issues that maybe led to amnesties and so forth. So all those cases that came out of protest, she just dealt with similarly. Right? So we think they should be dropped.
Chair, by way of clarity, in the report on page 11, and it's under 2C, Roman numeral 3, the commissioners actually asked that the cases be dealt with as cases, and not that there be a blanket ruling on them. And it's in that light that the executive is saying, that, well, let us do that then, and come to, not exactly as they indicate, but let us come to a view. So that's C3, Chair. That's the way I read that recommendation.
But at the same time, with respect to criminal proceedings, they also like to say that they recommend that some of those cases that universities, especially that pertain to criminal proceedings, they also recommend that UCT actually makes an application to the NDA that those cases also be withdrawn. So, yeah.
So, I mean, we'll come to the criminal proceedings, but I'm specifically referring to C3.
Yeah. So clearly there is work that needs to be done before we come to a conclusive point. And given that the Commission took a view that they're not going to deal with these matters, takes it back to the executive to advise us on what the best way to proceed with this is. I don't think that in the absence of a clear-cut recommendation from the Commission, we can take a recommendation as a steering committee to Council, because there are issues here that have to be taken into account. Yes, sir.
I'd like to agree with you. I mean, there's two things which I think it might be worth reminding ourselves of, which probably inform the Commission's stance on this. The first is that the Constitutional Court itself, in the Hotz case, was very clear that actions of the sort in the Hotz case should be proceeded with, that they shouldn't just be discarded. And we would not want to deviate from the Constitutional Court's recommendations on this. And secondly, that the Commission was very mindful that some of these crimes had victims, and that it was important for reconciliation that victims were able to have their voices heard in cases that affected them. So, for those two reasons, I would strongly support your position on this, Chair.
The report says, to quote, let's quote Justice Yaku, who says that racism is all-pervading cancer in the University of Cape Town. So I'm sitting with a question about how do I ask those who preside over the all-pervading cancer to decide what must happen to students who try to show up that cancer, that people refuse to recognize. That an entire nation said the students are throwing tantrums, they're the best university in the country. And the report is saying this wasn't a tantrum. There's a real problem in the university. And I really feel that to then ask the people who picked up phones to call police to beat students, who picked up phones and who made contracts with private security repeatedly, to come and beat and shoot our students, abuse the staff who had nothing to do with the protest as well. That's the same structure we're asking to decide what must happen. To me, there's a big disconnect here. I think that we need to be honest about that. It's not fair. I don't know what we're doing when we're giving it to the executive to make this decision.
But I do want to invite you to entertain the idea that you are part of the leadership that presides over the cancer of racism. Because in fact, as an alumni, you have representatives on council that when all of this was happening, it had the authority, ultimate authority, to put a stop to it. So if anybody is responsible, executive included, it starts with the council. So I think that when we embarked on this process, we were moving away from blame game and take collective responsibility to sort out the problem and move forward. And if we're going to do that, we must assume that the executive in place is committed to moving the institution. So they must do what is required to get us to the bottom of this. This recommendation here from outsiders places trust in the institution to actually do this. So it says we must actually consider whether there are disciplinary matters to be considered, they must be gone through, if there are pre-bargaining opportunities, that's what must happen, etc., etc. None of us is able to do that. The machinery to do that is executive. So, unfortunately, whatever we think of that, by the way, all the constituencies here have representatives of council in the nature of the composition of council. That's how it's constituted. Ultimately, that's the body that says yea or nay. It's the body that signed off on the deployment of security on campus. It's not executive acting outside of that authority. So I just want to suggest that we take a constructive view. The reality of the matter is that the executive is a legitimate executive that we appointed. And these problems are all of ours. You wanted to say something?
Yes, Chair. In an attempt to try and move us forward, I wanted to ask, most of the cases, are unlike there are cases that happens outside of a political movement. I'm here to, because part of my understanding, the reason why also the Commissioner could not deal was it was focused on a particular scope and timeline. From the 13th of February to perhaps when the agreement was met. But all of these things are happening within a particular political context. It would have been understandable if there was resistance, if these cases were not happening with that, they were just criminal activities happening. Perhaps our contention would be, why would you even allow a room to consider tribunal proceedings in a space where these issues were happening at a political movement, when there is an acknowledgement that that particular political movement, whether it's from the student perspective or the management perspective side, there were some wrongdoings or wrong acts that we have acted. So first of all, can these issues be considered within that first political climate? And two, also just to move us forward, if the executive is to deliberate, can we get a sense of a timeline? When we will get a report back, knowing very well that graduation is coming in April, and second students need to know whether the university still plans to pursue charges or it will drop them. So that we can also have a clear response to the constituency.
Yeah, Chair, I can't commit to a timeline, but I think it's also important for the executive to finalise these. They've been hanging around for quite a while. I think it's been helpful to hear all of the inputs, and of course the context of the cases will be taken into account. So, Chair, I will commit that we will discuss this against the backdrop of the recommendations from the IRTC. With respect to plea bargaining, having external people hearing the case to also take into account some of the other concerns, but we will then make a recommendation, and in the interest of speed, that may be a recommendation that we circulate for input as opposed to coming back to convene, because I think Ms. Ikole is right, there are students who may want to graduate, so we will work with speed. But also maybe, Chair, to say this, that related, I'm listening to some of the inputs. I just want to say that part of what this commission, we asked them to help us to get to reconciliation. And I think it will be useful if we begin to language in such a way that we commit ourselves as a steering committee to move towards reconciliation, and that we should actually set the tone. And that we do not, through our language, further the distrust. So I think some of the language is not helping us, and I really would like to call on the other members of the steering committee. We certainly committed as an executive to address the issues that was raised, and so it would be helpful if we get that commitment from other members as well.
Chair, I would want to be very honest. I think you're taking us down a very slippery slope here if you now say that issues that are not clarified by the commissioners need to be taken back to the executive. You also point out that the executive is an elected executive. We need to acknowledge that we have this commission even in the face of a properly constituted executive. So these are realities that we need to deal with. Because there is a lot of recommendations that the commissioners were not very clear about. Are we also going to just take them back to the executive? I seriously think you're taking us down a slippery slope. With regards to these cases, I completely disagree that the executive has anything to do with these cases. If you remember back with the three clemency cases, the commissioners themselves had offered that those should be referred to them. Hopefully, the executive said they don't see it necessary, they just agree with the fact that they're going to recommend amnesties. So I don't see any reason why, if push comes to shove, that offer of the commissioners is going to be taken up, that these matters be referred to whether it's the three commissioners. I do not see how the executive is going to move us forward in this contested terrain where there were an involved party in these cases, because these cases came out of protest. We now don't know issues around liability, because commissioners also say that the management had a role to play there. So they cannot now be the judge.
I understand clearly what you're saying. Are you saying that we should agree with the recommendation of the commissioners that three of them should consider the three cases that are outstanding?
No, not three cases. Now,
but then, you see, you cannot have your cake and eat it. The same executive that you're saying is questionable is saying that, taking note of what they are saying as a recommendation, we believe it won't serve us. It's better to deal with this in the form of a recommendation that grants the amnesty without going through that process.
But why are they not doing that the same thing for the 33 cases?
Because the report submitted by the commissioners gives due regard to the fact that complainants have rights as well. And this body has no competency to make a direct recommendation to council. So there is an intermediate step. So these commissioners are saying to us that they are not going to consider these cases. The executive must look into them, and the recommendation must be made in terms of the disciplinary processes. What you are suggesting is that we must put that aside, and they must just go on the basis of the steering committee, without having considered the matters associated with this, with the recommendation to council that they must be dropped.
Yes.
It just doesn't make sense. If a slippery slope there was any, that's an even more slippery slope that you are putting us through. I mean, this is just defies all principles of natural justice.
I think
that we should have a mature conversation. In the conversation, we should display a measure of maturity. We're not. I mean, you're not going to get.
Who are you assigning immaturity to, Chair?
No, I'm saying to you.
Who are you assigning immaturity?
I'm saying to you that the council that you're going to make a recommendation to will know that this steering committee has no authority to make a recommendation that has no basis in law, that defies everything that is said in this report.
Jefferson, I think we theory is getting to or something that I choose out from the theory argument, like in just the narrow arguments that both the executive and management had a role to play in the events of what we have in the report, right? And right now we come to situation by imputing liability on only the one and not on the other, and which is why I think this from the various circumstances, overall from our circumstances, once you eliminate the executive, because the executive was also a proponent in some of the actions that has happened and they led to protest actions. And therefore the question really never asked is, to which can we then have a process of national justice whereby both parties are brought to the table instead of just the many students are just which students are just the ones that are prosecuted in the executive. There's no liability, there's no accountability for the executive. And it is in that sense whereby the question is, how do we eliminate the executive from this process? Because the executive is also a part to the same dispute.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that, which is a different point, that we're sitting with a recommendation that says that these outstanding cases, the Commission is saying that it's not going to deal with those cases, so we can't take them here. There is a point that is being made that it may not be desirable for the executive to deal with those cases. So now the question is, who deals with those cases? So, I mean, I don't have an issue with you saying that you don't want the executive to deal with them. I think you do need to say, though, who should deal with them and how they should be dealt with. But what I'm objecting to is a suggestion that the steering committee can somehow just make a recommendation that these cases must be dropped, because legally council would not be able to take that decision. So I don't have an objection to another intermediary step of processing those.
Chair, I would like to remind the committee what you had proposed as a way forward, which was agreed to by Masituri, I think, at the very beginning, was that the executive makes a proposal which will be considered by this committee. And so this committee will consider that proposal on its merits. It's not that the executive has a final say on what should be done on this. It's this committee which will deliberate on that. So that was a very good proposal, and I think I would like to move the committee to adopt that and then we move forward.
I recount the proposal, Chair, like I said before you interrupted me with the three cases. So the commissioners had offered, right, to have the three cases referred. So now instead of the three cases, we now have these cases instead. We say that in the same spirit of restorative justice, right, can we also deal with these outstanding 33 cases? To me, that would be the most reasonable way forward, because it cuts out people who are implicated in all these processes.
These are two categories of cases. One is cases that where disciplinary processes were followed and a conclusive finding was made and they were considered for amnesty and all this. The second category is one where there are allegations which have not been considered, have not gone through the same process. And the commissioners have made clear that they are not interested in considering those cases. So we have a clear categorical statement from commissioners that they are going to deal with those cases. I don't know what purpose it serves to go back to them and ask them to do the same thing they told us they were not prepared to do.
Chair, I don't think we attended the same meeting on Monday. I would maybe want to have a review of the video on Monday. The commissioners did not say they were not prepared. They were asked that question. They specifically said the only reason they could not move was that the university had not prepared charges on these students, so they did not know what it is that they should deal with. Right? So now, we are now telling them that these are the charges, right? So that they can deal with. They did not say that they don't want to deal with these cases. That's not my, we have to look at that tape. They say the university did not give them a list of charges for them to consider. So they did not know what it is that was being asked of them.
Chair, I still think that this issue, complicated as it is, can't be dealt thoroughly by this platform at this moment. I mean, I hear all views. I mean, I'm sympathetic to the fact that we cannot just say on a blanket approach, people must be given, those charges must be withdrawn, especially when we don't even know the nature of the charges. But I do want to recommend that if these charges are at the same time at the political events, the same processes of restorative justice must be considered at length, because these are not criminal charges. These are, of course, even though we respect the right of the complaint, these are political charge issues which must be understood. And I want to stress the agency of dealing with these court cases so that when we come to second semester or when we go to graduation, we don't find ourselves in the situation where we're dealing with outstanding issues. They are far substantive issues that we need to deal with the recommendations. And I'm worried that if we are unable to find each other on this issue, which I think is some technical issues, I think we might lose the whole point.
Yes, I agree with that. Now, I really want to urge this steering committee. The people who sit with the body of information around these matters is the executive. So they must go and do the work they need to do and come back to us with a recommendation of what needs to be done. On the basis of that, we can decide to set up a tribunal that is not made up of, it's not an internal tribunal, it can be an external tribunal, it can be whatever it is. There is an intermediate step that has to be taken that will guide our decision. Somebody has to do the work that takes us there. And I do want to say this, that I don't subscribe to the idea that we have an illegitimate executive. So this oppositional naive notion about executive position, the truth of the matter is that we have a leadership in the executive that is guided by the work that has been done here, that is instructive. And it says, let's find a resolution to these matters that gives due regard to justice, but creates a platform for reconciliation.
But Jefferson, I think something that you missed in my argument is that if we're saying that we're going to reconcile, and reconcile is the two parties coming together in the spirit of restoration to justice, right? Even if you get a third commission whereby we get an intermediate step, only those students who may have charges against them are being brought to trial. And because the rate of events and executive actions that they may have made them act in one way or another is not actually called into account. It was never called into account in the amnesty process. Even in this account, it's not being called into account. If you read the report, it went to extensive submissions about how causality about the capability of executive actions, the causality, and to what extent they may have contributed to violence. But no way do we actually have, a platform whereby the executive comes to the table and says, this is what we've done, and for that this is what we regret, or for that we apologize, so we acknowledge the harm that we've contributed to. Even in the third platform, we're only looking at the students wrong, the student capability, and not at the executive actions. So I'm just worried, I'm not sure whether I'm making a recommendation or and where I could read this in the report, but I'm just worried about at which point we will get to a platform whereby the executive also comes and gives due regard and accountability or acknowledgement of their own actions.
Can we agree that that's a separate point that we need to deal with about executive culpability and accountability? But can we deal with this? Can we conclude this specific point about these outstanding cases? Because it's an important recommendation to deal with conclusively. We need to be clear about how we proceed, because there are complaints made, investigations done, and these have to be dealt with, and so conclusively. Are we happy to proceed that we allow the executive to do what they have to do and come back to us with a set of recommendations that will form the basis of our recommendation to the Steering Committee Council? Because I don't know that we have another mechanism of getting to that. I'm going to put this to a vote now because we've been deliberating on it for long enough. Those that are in favor that we proceed on that basis, can we?
Chairman, I think a vote would be, not the best. Thank you. To move forward.
I beg your pardon?
I don't think voting would be the best way to take us forward.
Okay, help me. I prefer that we don't vote. That we have a consensus. But I'm aware also that we've got several recommendations and we only dealt with two. We've only dealt with one.
Yes, Chair, thank you. Maybe as a way forward, my understanding that there are no charges against the students at the moment. Correct? Can we maybe first have charges then? And then once we have charges, then we can move to the next.
Yeah, Chair, I think the acting VC did mention that there are different types of students. There are those who were charged, but because we entered into an agreement, those charges were put into a pause. There are those who they were planning to be charged, so meaning they were in process to be given to them, and those students have not been. So there's a list that varies, and in that she did mention that there are a number of cases that were recommended to the IRTC to be dealt with within the confines, meaning that there was a strong sense that these issues can be within the confines of reconciliation and restorative. Now, I think without wasting any time, I do support, by the way, the notion that the executive must give us the data of how many of these people that were supposedly going to are charged or supposed to be charged, and then give us the data of cases that they feel strong that these cases should be, be withdrawn, and cases, and also give us a list of cases which they feel, based on the information that they have and the complaints and the nature of these cases, maybe they need a different platform and a different thinking, so that we can get a sense, because we don't really know who's who in this zoo of charges, So I just for the sake of continuity, but all of this must happen under the understanding that this is an attempt of restorative justice.
I mean, that's the only basis on which we are discussing this here. Because after all, in any event, the executive has a responsibility in terms of its legal obligation. There have been transgressions. They have a responsibility to ensure that those are investigated, where disciplinary action has to be taken, that disciplinary action has to be taken. So it's not about giving executive permission to do what they have to do, because the commission has not dealt with these and they're outstanding. They would have to do it anyway. But in the context of what we've been going through, we are saying that they must continue to do that work and come back to us and say, these cases, 12 we've identified, will be dropped, maybe more should be dropped, and in the following areas, we think that there's room to do plea bargains, etc., etc. And these are outstanding cases where full-on disciplinary processes will be followed. And we deal with it on that basis. We don't have a basis to deal with it outside of that. Anyway, are we happy to proceed on that basis?
Yeah.
Any objections? Okay. We note your objections. So, okay, so are there any comments in respect of other recommendations?
Chair, of course, I mean, the recommendation is not really that strong, and which is around the question of two issues. One is the decolonization part. I know the university is going through some curriculum review thing, but I think in a sense that the recommendation should, I don't know if we're allowed to twist it around, but I'm saying that there needs to be a deliberate conversation in the university that kickstarts this process, not only in saying speaking about decolonization, but speaking even on issues that we disagree. We know of professors, which some of them are around us, who have written very bad things online on their papers, and no one has contested them because maybe they hold a professorship in some departments, and students are afraid to tell them that what they are writing is actually wrong. Yes, this is the opportunity, in which the university can have that open discussion. I know some of us have been, feeling strong that there has not been a deliberateness from the university to contest some of old ideas that have come out in the academy. I don't know how council can go about doing this on top of the recommendation that there has to be a panel, but we're tired of commissions and panel, but there has to be a deliberateness on how the university, both on demographics, but also the orientation of the university in terms of the ideas, is taken into consideration. So I wanted to second the decolonization recommendation, but with an emphasis on dealing with the different debates that have emerged. We don't have to point in. We know people who have disagreed with the process. We know people who have agreed with the process. We bring them together and see how, as the university, we can find a model of dealing with this issue.
Would it be helpful if I asked Professor Ferris to give us feedback on proposals on how, as executive, given that, I mean, you're raising an issue, for instance, now that there is a process around decolonization. There may be processes in respect of other areas of how they think we might deal with some of these and come to some engagement.
Chair, maybe to say that I think there's several things that are going on. One of the things that we've asked ourselves is to what extent there may be lecturers individually that's already kind of doing the work of decol in their curriculum and in their classroom. And I think we are sort of 3 years down the road from Rhodes Must Fall, and it would be a good time to kind of do a mapping to see where we are, because we need to understand where we are and where the gaps are. So that's work that we would like to do. The other is that we need to finalize the conversation around the framework, as the VC has indicated most recently when she communicated with the university. But at the same time, there are debates that are happening. I know, for example, that the College of Fellows will soon have a discussion around decolonization. So there is work that is happening. Whether we want to take on the recommendation as it stands, I think we could certainly sort of agree that we need to enter the, well, we don't have to enter the discourse, we're already in the discourse, but there's just some parts of that recommendation that we would like to probably get more clarity for ourselves. So I for example, I don't know what it means to enter the discourse in our country, and in conjunction with all other universities. So I mean, it's one of those recommendations that's just, it's somewhat vague, and we would like to maybe respond and say, this is the way that we would like to deal, or that we are dealing with decolonization, and rather come with a recommendation that the steering committee may say, okay, this is not exactly the words of the recommendation, but we agree with this as a way forward. So that's the kind of work that we would like to do, probably in the majority of these recommendations, to kind of see what we're already doing, how it links to what the Commission is saying, and that we can agree to a way forward.
Yeah. So it's some kind of mapping exercise that says on employment equity, for instance, I would have thought that the human resources team would give us an indication of what's going on there, and how is that work different from what is being recommended here, and what of what is emerging here means there should be changes to the way we are doing that work. And I think that's where it becomes concrete.
Yes, Chair, I just want to second largely what Professor Ferris is saying. For me, when I was saying the implications of some of it, it's a good example, because even do we all understand that have the same shared meaning of decolonization? But yes, what does it mean when we're talking about engaging decolonization with other universities in the country? I think there's a lot of stuff being said.
Yeah.
It makes sense to me that in our constituencies we need to engage more, so that we have an understanding of what are also the expectations, what's the reality, in terms of, as Prof. Ferris is outlining, there are actions being taken, and what is that, but also what do people expect? We've spoken about, and maybe some groups are very clear in the university about what they mean by decolonization, but what do others, I don't know if everybody's clear. And so to my mind, that is important, and a good example, but it's such a crucial thing. And it's crucial that in the end we all agree on what we're talking about. so that, you know, ideally we're all moving together in the same direction. And I think that is what ultimately we're trying to achieve. So, yeah, so I just want to support that. And I think that's relevant to a couple of other points.
Thank you. I think perhaps to comment, I think many aspects of the recommendation I want to comment on. So I think that will be done perhaps over the course of time. But I think keeping in mind the specific council meeting, there's one specific recommendation, that's number 13, executive personnel, and I think for firm in I am not accepting security personnel and private security on campuses. I think that's we think that private security, that the justifications that have been made for it haven't warranted private security presence. One. We also think that the recommendations that are made in points 3 to point 6 also presuppose that there actually is legislation in the country which significantly can govern how private security is contracted onto universities and implemented. But it's actually a very new thing. So private security presence being used for public order is a relatively new phenomenon. We don't see why we should be subjected to the whims, essentially, of how management will decide to implement policy when there even isn't any broad scope of law which governs the actual process of recruiting or vetting or the kind of actions that private security is allowed to take onto campus. So I think that's a very basic, for the purpose of like a preliminary response. Yeah, I think confirming the position that we don't accept, or at least we don't recommend security personnel and private security specifically on campus.
So you reject that?
We have wholesale.
13. Well, you could be careful to say wholesale because it says here under 13.2 bullet point 2.
I said 13 bullet point 3 to bullet point 6. That's what I was referring to when I was saying that.
No, I hear you, but he says that wholesale.
Wholesale as far as private security is concerned on campus. Because I would recommend that CPAs rather be equipped in order to deal with problem situations. For CPAs, then you've got virus. You can there's accountability for CPAs. Yeah. You can say the CPAs officer did X and Z to me. But like, assume with private security, assume that students will be able to identify which security officer has done X and Y to them. And two, it just operates on a certain basis that there's a particular training that management has, that there's particular control that management has over private security, which they don't have. Because if you look at the recommendations, it presupposes that when they say that management needs to vet private security, it presupposes that management will be able to vet the militarization of private security, how they've been trained and orientated, and how they control. And I'm saying that it's not necessarily the case. But with CPAs, there's a direct line of command and control that management has. So rather, the recommendation should read that CPAs be equipped to deal with protest situations and not private security.
Yeah. I hear that, but I mean, Council is going to take a view on these recommendations, giving due regard to emphasis made here on kind of constitutional society that we are and the legal obligations that arise to protect property, staff, and people in the institution, what that means. And I think that's what the commissioners are grappling with here, of those tensions. And the debate that has been started about procedures on this, which has been doing rounds, is also trying to grapple with that. But one of the things that I found, which I would have liked to be emphasized here, is that nothing we do should undermine promoting a culture of free expression and protest, which is part of an important element of a democratic society. So if you have a university which circumscribes protest by young people, we come from that environment of having protested as young people. The environment must promote that at the university within certain confines of respect for all of this. But anyway, this was always going to be a controversial recommendation.
You have said, Chair, what I wanted to say. Let me not add. But in relation to the prior discussion on decolonization, perhaps I could just add that I support the recommendation. I think the recommendation is trying to suggest that there should be decolonization at the broader level debate. But in concrete terms, the university has undertaken many steps, including faculties, to change the curriculum. And there is that curriculum change policy that is being developed that will continue, I know. But the one aspect that is not in the recommendation but could be emphasized in the council is that this debate can also be divisive, and at times it's not inclusive. It tends to be used more in political rhetoric instead of advancing the academic goals of really trying to question our curriculum, the way we conduct ourselves through the prism of the notion of decolonization. So it's an important debate, but it has to be inclusive and not marginalized.
I wonder if, I think we should come to a conclusion on this. What I'm hearing is that there is consultation still that needs to be done with regard to the recommendations. Some are acceptable, some are not. But I mean, the very first recommendation, given that the longest chapter here is on racial discrimination on campus, I sometimes think that we probably, I know that social science or humanities should be best placed to facilitate these, but I suspect that we need an intervention from an entity or a party that has a little bit of distance from the institution to assist, because managing diversity is a very complex and difficult matter. So these departments would also be affected by this, and there would be a huge amount of subjectivity. So I think that recommendation may be a mistake, but the principle of it makes sense, that we need to understand better what are the underlying factors of discrimination. And I dare say that they go beyond just racism. They're about gender inequalities, they're about various forms of divisions and differences in the society. And what does affirmation of diversity mean, actually? Because there is a narrative that the dominant culture in this institution is white privileged culture. I don't know if the answer, though, is necessarily that should be replaced by what you would call black culture, whatever that means, or other culture, whatever that means. Because diversity actually means embracing all of those, whatever they are. What does that look like as a journey? And society seems to me that is ill-equipped to deal with it, and there should be no pretense that this institution is equipped to deal with it. But it starts with a conversation. I think that this is a complex area of engagement, which, if we don't get right, this institution is not going to come right, in my view. We're going to have these contestations all the time as heated contestations. So we're not about assimilation of any group in the culture or image of the other. We are about diversity. What does it mean? So it's a complex area, but my observation is that the commissioners may have erred in suggesting that one of the parties to the complex difficulties that we have would probably be well placed to do this work. You may hold a different view, but I think that is one of the things that we should be thinking about.
Thank you, Chair. I want to sound a warning here. And this is after looking at some of the recommendations. One of the dangers, or one of the symptoms of the problems at DCT, everybody chooses to interpret situations in ways that are convenient to them. And these recommendations are where I see a problem coming in, that everybody will choose to interpret them in a way that is convenient and easiest for them. And now I'll give an example here. The chapter on racism deals with very much with structural issues and intangible racism. Racism where you can't, it's not coming from an individual act. But if I look at recommendation number 10, it very much seems like speaking to individual acts of racism. And I think this is creates a problem, because somebody may look at that and say, well, if there aren't individual acts of racism, then there can be no structural racism. So I think we have to be very careful that moving forward, that if we come to how we choose to interpret these recommendations, that there should be a consensus about how the recommendations are interpreted. So for example, if it's structural, we're looking at recommendation number 10, for example. We should have an understanding of how we measure structural racism. Things like that. And it has to be concrete and has to be measured. Otherwise, we'll be back in this same situation where everybody one person says there's no racism, another person says yes, there is structural racism, and the two never meet.
Yeah, Chair, I sense a bit of a, it's gonna be a problem, but it's something that we cannot avoid. In a sense that we will have different interpretations over what is racism or diversity for that matter. Reason being because we are allocated or socialized differently in the society in which we live in. And you sit here as a university that belongs into a particular country which has deeper issues like of racism, cannot act oblivious to the fact that those different interpretations are nothing but questions of power relations in society. For example, we are not going to agree here that the university in its holistic sense is a racist university, because racism means different things to different people. We are not going to agree. Neither are we going to come with the principle dominator of, regardless, these are the things that we may change or not. So in moving us forward, Chair, I do suggest that even if we do call someone from outside to deal with these issues, I don't think there can be a point where we can conclude on this issue. I do think that the university must foster a spirit of conversation, particularly to those who have written. There are people who have written in this university things that are shocking when we read them. We want them to come in public when we have these things, to explain their position. Why is racism in South Africa can be an alleged situation, for example? Why do you think that racism is a structural problem? You know, so that even if we don't deal with them, we would have started with the processes of trying to understand each other. Because these are issues of power relations at the end of the day. I don't think we would ever agree on them. But also on this question of diversity, my concern was how does the university, because even the report does say that the demographics of this university are not reflective of the demographics of the country. At some point where the race-based policy that we had, Dr. Price came and did a new different thing. So how are we going to deal with that in relation to diversity? Are we going to look at the number of policies over the years as the university to look at what has worked into increasing our numbers? Or we are going to look at, even if we do increase our numbers, what is it that makes people feel alienated within the university? Is it the design, the setup of the university? It is the fact that no one, a black child from culture, does not find a lecture who they can relate to? Or is it the fact that there's no much black students who are on postgrad? Or what are the causes? So entire things that we can perhaps touch and untouch that creates the atmosphere of alienation.
Couldn't have put it better. But we have the difficult situation that the interpreters did ask ahead of time to leave at 5 because they're using public transport. And I had hoped that would be done by now. But they should feel free to go when they are ready to do so. And unfortunately, I must apologize to those who are benefiting from the sign language interpretation that will proceed for the remaining minutes to few minutes, I hope, to take the meeting to conclusion if they have to be. But I must thank you very much for your assistance, both of you. Much appreciated. Let's hear Jeremy.
So, we seem to be jumping around from recommendation to recommendation. I'm getting a bit confused here. And you started us off thinking about specific recommendations. Just on one very quick point, just to underscore a point that you yourself made about the first two recommendations, members of Senate, many members of Senate made the point that Senate is very committed to serious discussion, deliberation over issues of diversity and decolonisation. We know that, it's already proceeding. They also reiterated a point that I think you made, which is that the expertise within the university on these issues is not limited to the departments that are mentioned. And even within the university, there are many other departments and many faculties with expertise to contribute to these debates. And I was asked to make that point.
Okay, I think where this is taking us, I just don't know. I agree with your point about structural, the example you make about structural racism, but you know we're at a place where the systemic character of alienation in this environment needs to be unraveled. So there's a degree to which some of the subliminal manifestations of racism and discrimination that are structural have to be dealt with. So I just don't want us to be paralyzed by this notion that there's all of this and therefore we can't deal with it. So we would need to find a way to be quite specific, and I think that's what this section under 10 seems to be suggesting, is that we need to have very specific programs that seek to deal with policy changes, implementations of programs, monitoring of those, and making sure that those things do happen. I don't think that we can pretend that all of those interventions will necessarily, in all instances, deal conclusively with the underlying structural issues, but may impact on them. So we have to be quite deliberate about coming out with strategies and programs that seek to chip away at that. And I think that's a very important recommendation in my view, because part of what exploded here was around symbols, and those sort of taken for granted thing that this is who UCT is, but it actually brought about a debate that says these symbols actually are not about us. They are insulting to some of us. So let's have a debate about that. Let's have a debate about the fact that the classical environment is dominated by lecturers who are white and not black, and why is that? And we need to change that. So the point that Mascolo is making is exactly it, that there is a debate to be had here about all of these issues. But if we confine it to a level of debate and have no programmatic interventions that follow through, we'll fall short. So we'll have to land on those.
Yes, Chair. But that's exactly my point. That's the first of my point.
Yeah.
Is that there can't be a fuzziness about this. I mean, it's now 25 years since the end of apartheid, and if you go and look at departments, and look at the lack of black South African academics, and you compare that to all the activities that have been done to transform the university all the years, you have to ask, why is it that in spite of all of these activities, there hasn't been change? And I was saying is that the reason that there hasn't been change is because some people choose to see the situation that exists as not being problematic. It's a matter of interpretation. And that I'm just saying that that window, that fuzziness, it cannot never be removed, but it should be much narrower than it is now. So I'm just saying that I do not disagree with what has been said. I'm just saying that if there was greater overlap about interpretations of the current situation, greater progress will be made.
Chair, there are lessons to be learned from other institutions, not necessarily universities or limited universities, but big corporations and so on, where when institutions have said we need to change, and they've said, how are we going to do this? We don't know. You know, we are the classic apartheid white institution. Example is Treasury, the Department of Treasury, just as one example. But that underwent a significant change to look different, respond differently, engage differently with the South African society. It's a department that has a lot less criticism than some others as a consequence. And so I'm just making an example, but this is true even for some corporates. So my point is that I think we also need to look at, it's not in here, but I think I'm picking up part of what Dr. Sitole is talking about, the matter of how do we monitor, you know, how do we know that we're getting somewhere meaningfully? And it's not because precisely we think we're getting somewhere, then when we looked we said, oh my goodness. So there's a need for strong monitoring and evaluation type recommendation. I don't think we can come up with it today. That's one part. But the other piece for me is that we do need to try and identify some good examples that we all take responsibility to learn from. Because and one simple thing is that people, you know, their job performance, you start to get measured by the appointments you make, by the advancement of your team, by how you prioritize, depending on what your job is, but kind of like the thematic areas you will investigate. You know, what is the priorities? Because we want priorities to look in a particular way and so on. So I think there's possibilities, and we need to also, as an institution, start to look at those good examples.
Thank you very much. Okay, Loretta, the last one.
Yeah, Chair, I think it will be useful for us to come back as an exec and to actually talk to what we're already doing, and we may find that a lot of these things are already happening. So, for example, we've rolled out a student inclusivity survey last year. We're now analyzing the data. We're about to roll out a staff inclusivity survey, and that's exactly to deal with the how do we measure the shift. And so the idea with that survey is it's going to go out in May. We want to do get quantitative and qualitative data. So it will be a survey followed up by focus group to understand the extent to which staff feel included, excluded. To shape intervention, or to look at our current interventions and see what else we need to do to kind of do more in terms of the interventions that we are rolling out already, and we'll certainly report on those, and to re-measure in 2023. So I think it will be useful, Chair, if we can come and we can actually talk to what we're already doing, and I think within. And that's just from a central point of view, but the latest transformation report also speaks to what some of the departments are doing in terms of the dialogues that they're having around these issues. So things are happening, Chair, and I think it'll be, perhaps it'll be much more constructive if we can talk to what we're already doing. Renu and I just this morning talked about the whole performance management issue and bringing that into contracts. So yeah, and that may take us forward, and whatever we introduce is what we're doing can then be used to take or to build on.
So may I suggest that we leave it at that, and that is council will be presented with a very specific recommendation from us here in respect of the amnesties for the 3 outstanding students, and secondly that with regard to the outstanding cases we will hear from the executive. Now I would suggest that we should be prepared to convene as a steering committee to entertain that recommendation from the executive. If there's a recommendation that needs to be considered by council, we will be prepared to make to ask council to be prepared to convene to consider that recommendation, given the request that that this matter be expedited, given the fact that some students will be affected in terms of graduation. As for the rest of the recommendations, I'm hearing everybody to be saying that these need to be engaged with further and need to be considered more in depth. And I think more haste, less speed is the way we should proceed. We should allow conversations to flow, and maybe the steering committee will convene before the next council in June, and with a view to making a recommendation to council on how we proceed with regard to the other specific recommendations. Jeremy?
Many members of the Senate asked me to raise one point, which is about a recommendation which is missing. May I do so?
Yeah.
Many members of the Senate regretted that there wasn't a clear recommendation around a code of conduct for protests at the university. That this is one of the issues that have been repeatedly discussed in different fora, and we understood that the IRTC would be considering it, and they haven't actually given us a recommendation. And I know this is a very serious concern to academic members of staff, to the Senate, to the AU, to the EU. We have raised it repeatedly, and we still don't seem to. Well, we would urge council to really consider this issue, even though there's no specific recommendation on it. We regret that absence.
I think I want to get you first.
I don't want to get you first.
I think the recommendation is made. I've read it. But like the only difference that the commissioners went and said that management should not only have code of conduct that manages protests, but they should have a code of conduct that makes sure, actually in their words, they said that makes sure that students do not overplay their hands, but neither must management. It must be a code of conduct that manages both parties about when they both are protesting. They actually made a recommendation that protest policy must be equitable and must be horizontal and not vertical in terms of just managing student protests. It must be managing both student and student actions in times and classes of protests. I don't know which page number, but it's actually in the report.
62.
62.
Yeah, on page 62 it says draft protest action policy. It speaks to both, what you said.
No, Chair, I was going to say that there is something around which I also read that sort of urges again the university community to deal with how effectively things it can carry out protest. But I also want to worry that any policy that comes with trying to confine, protest in the university must always be, first in consideration of whether we agree with the Constitution or not, what the Constitution sort of says around having a right to protest but not infringing on other people's rights as you are protesting. And of course, with the latest announcements that one does not need to tell that I'm coming to demonstrate, I can just come and demonstrate anymore. Because most of the time, our disagreements in the past is that there was never been any form of communication to tell people whether I was planning to protest or not. So I think in some way, somehow, the university, as it deals with the condition, it must think about the condition in which it finds itself before setting out a blueprint on how to protest. I think it would be dangerous to set an absolute blueprint on how to protest in the university. But I think we must be sensitive to not being able to infringe on other people's rights, even though the university has been infringing on a lot of majority people on their rights. So those things must be taken into consideration at the same time.
So it turns out that Senate is the slowest council in reading documents. You couldn't get to page 62 to read this.
It's not Chair, it's not in the list of recommendations.
No.
There are many recommendations in the text that are not included in the list of recommendations, and that's a bit of that also raises questions in my mind. I assume you're asking us to consider the recommendations listed under recommendations, which are not entirely consistent with some of the things in individual chapters.
Yeah.
And I would also point out, of course, that one of the commissioners dissented from one of the chapters.
Yeah, the addendum.
Yeah.
Chair, in fairness to the commissioners, they did point out that their recommendations should be read in terms of the recommendations given at the end of each chapter.
Yes.
That was clear.
Fairness.
You want to read that first, Terry? Don't worry, we're in the same boat. Council and Senate.
What are you asking us to respond to?
No. I suggest that we leave it at that. I don't think that we can take it much further. I think that this is an important report. Interestingly, though, that one of the things about some of the challenges that we're facing have to do with the changes that have happened in the institution. Can have sizable changes, significant changes that we've had in the student body, and not have the contestations that we have, because the institutional culture hasn't changed to take cognizance of the fact that you've had these changes. So as the institution changes, these challenges are going to be with us. So we should take that into account. It remains for me to thank everybody for making this meeting. It was a very important conversation. And I hope that when we meet next time, we'll also deliberate about the future of this body, which was established specifically to deal with this. Now we have the final product. I think our biggest responsibility is to give council a view on how this should be proceeded with. This is not a standing committee of council. It's an ad hoc committee, so its work should come to an end. So we'll extend it until the next council meeting in June, until the June council meeting, for council to take a view on it, because we need it to make recommendations on how to proceed with this. Are we happy with that? Thank you very much. Meeting closed.